Monster in My Pocket was a comic book series back in the early 90s that generated enough interest for Konami to adapt the series into an NES game. The game's plot centers around two creatures as small toy figures watching TV when Warlock interrupts their downtime by sending his minions out to destroy them. There's not really much to the story, but it's something. Don't know why he wants them destroyed, but I've never read any of the comic books to understand anyways. The game is your average run-of-the-mill side-scroller, taking control of either the vampire or the monster, going through each level killing off monsters, and that's essentially the whole game right there. There's usually two parts, as well as a boss battle for each level. Again, nothing much different to these levels, although not all of them follow the left and right linear path as you can clearly see. As mentioned, you can play as either the vampire or the monster, but regardless of which one you choose, the gameplay itself remains the same. Both characters have the same attack and same double jump ability, which, believe it or not, was pretty new around the time the game came out, which is something. Neither of them have any unique abilities of their own, like sucking blood or strangle an enemy or turn into a bat or anything than just punching at short range, which is pretty effective, especially if you're encountered by multiple enemies from more than one direction, at which you'll have to react pretty fast if you don't want to get damaged much, seeing that the temporary invincibility is kind of brief. Regardless of which character you play as, you only get 5 hit points until you lose a life, unless you come upon some hearts, which aren't scarce, but if you're low on health, you'll be begging for them. Getting back to the enemies, they start out easy, but as you advance, they become pretty challenging and will require more than one hit for certain enemies, and it gets vigorous when you have to deal with several tough enemies on screen, at which I usually find myself running away from. There's barely any objects to interact with in the game, which is kind of unusual, seeing that you're the size of an action figure. I would expect something out of Toy Story. To compensate, you can pick up items like keys and bolts to throw at enemies, but there's not many of them. Each level is pretty unique in more ways than one, even though it's the same routine. They at least make some strong effort to break the cycle. The graphics are pretty good, but that's no surprise since this has Konami's name on it. I mean, let's face it, anything that has Konami labeled on it will offer something above average. All of the monsters and levels are greatly detailed, and the animation is spot on, especially when you run down fast, which only happens once in the game, sadly. The only thing I don't like about the graphics is the occasional flickering of sprites. I have griped before of when there's an overwhelming amount of enemies on the screen, the sprites will flicker. But in this game, you could be dealing with very little amount of enemies and the sprites will still flicker. I'm not sure how quality control was for Konami back in the early 90s. I'd say it's kind of good, but then again it was never perfect. If you look at some of their earlier games like Contra, you'll notice some flickering issues, but despite that, it became a classic. You can especially notice it with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Even with this side effect, it doesn't damage much of the integrity of the game and its visual presentation. Here's something worth noting. The Monster in My Pocket logo on the lower right corner along with the start of each level looks exactly like that of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles logo. It isn't jaw-dropping, but I thought it was worth noting. The controls are very simple. You punch with B no matter who you play as, you jump with the A button, and if you press it twice, you'll double jump. To pick up objects, you have to press down and B and throw with the attack button. For the most part, the controls are tight, although the pacings can get a bit sluggish, but you hardly ever notice it. You'll also have to get fast on responding to the actions when more enemies will charge at you. I've also heard about jumping higher with the double jump by hitting A twice while holding the B button, but I don't see a slight difference between the regular double jumps and the other kind. Aside from that, the controls are as plain as they can be and nearly flawless. The music is pretty good. You can just listen to any of these tunes and recognize Konami's touch of magic within them. They're pretty upbeat, even though they're not memorable. The sound effects are also good, although you might have heard some of them from previous Konami games. I especially like the digitized voices for the bosses after you defeated them. They definitely sound like a monster in defeat. While this game doesn't have a lot of new innovations, it's pretty underrated, thus me covering it. You shouldn't have a hard time beating the game as long as you can respond to the dangers coming. What makes this game unique is that with the two players, you can have both characters on the same screen rather than waiting for one player to die in order for the next to play. It's just like Contra, but without the guns. This may not be the greatest overlooked game, but it is pretty fun, and if you can get past the simple gameplay and the challenge it contains, you'll find some satisfaction within this gem. Thanks for watching. I'm Riley Sky. See you later.